Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Everyone got lunch okay? Everyone's heard the announcement to put cell phones off rather than on vibrate so that our sound system won't pick up the vibrate signal and interrupt the speakers. I'm Paul Dickler. I work for the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, among other jobs. And it is my very, very great pleasure to introduce Kimberly Kagan to you. Kimberly Kagan is president of the Institute for the Study of War. She is a military historian who has taught at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, Yale University, Georgetown University, and American University. She is currently an affiliate of the Olin Institute for Strategic Studies at Harvard University. She is the author of The Eye of Command, University of Michigan Press, 2006, and editor of The Imperial Moment, under contract with Harvard University Press. Her doctorate is from Yale in history. And currently, there are two projects near and dear to her heart. There is the Iraq Report, a monthly report on the war that she writes. You may find that at www.understandingwar.org. And she's also working on a book, The Grand Strategy in the Later Roman Empire. You could be looking for that around 2010, Yale University Press, assuming the usual course of events in writing books. Maybe 2009? Maybe 2011. Anyway, great pleasure to introduce Kimberly Kagan to you all. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me here today to talk with you about a subject that I think we should all care about quite passionately, military history. And we care about it quite passionately because we are American citizens. We are citizens of a democracy, and we have an obligation to study military history. And so I'm here to talk to you about why and how to teach history in the ancient world, but I'm also here to ask a first question, which is why teach military history at all? And although Professor Black has given us a wonderful overview of the different ways of teaching military history and different reasons to do so, I also find that I am drawn to the study of war because war is a complex human phenomenon and it's very difficult to understand. And it is necessary for me as a citizen of a democracy to understand war, to understand its course, to understand the policy decisions that lead to it, and also to understand the reasons why wars don't necessarily go as planned. But I'm also very interested in studying war to understand what war is. And I think that it's worth taking a step back and asking, what is war and how should we study it? Because it really does dictate a little bit how we approach the subject in the classroom. As you know, I've had the privilege of teaching cadets at West Point. I've also had the privilege of teaching civilians at civilian universities. And cadets, I taught world history to. Civilians, I've taught military history to. And so it actually has been a very exciting dynamic to try to figure out whether and how one can explain the nature of war, both to those who will participate in it as young officers, and to those who will participate in it simply as citizens of a democracy, or those who will participate in it as policymakers ultimately in Washington, D.C. But all three groups need to understand war in the same way and for the same reasons. They need to understand that war is an extension of policy, as Clausewitz says, that it cannot actually be divorced from the study of policy or politics, that it is not separate from other human endeavors, the other endeavors of states, but rather part and parcel of the policy making that states routinely do, and that war is not simply violence, but it is a violent means to an end. It is violence directed at a mission. And the violence, though part and parcel of war, is not really what we are trying to study when we are trying to understand war. We can't pretend war is nonviolent, but we cannot also simply study war as the violent act of individuals on the ground in combat in in places far-flung around the world. What we have to understand is that war is a product of states, of organizations, of armies, of institutions, of human beings interacting with one another and interacting with enemies in order to accomplish an overarching political objective. That's what distinguishes war from other forms of violence. And in doing that, we realize that when we think about the study of war, we really must focus on war as a human phenomenon, not something that is a technical phenomenon of weapons, of systems. It's not, in fact, possible to devise a theory of war that will have some sort of predictive quality at the end. But rather, we need to understand that war is about human beings making decisions in crisis for the benefit of their states and sometimes to the detriment of their states. And when we think about war in all of its complexity, then we can actually approach the study of war in the classroom in a way that is possible and educational for students at any level of study, whether they are junior high school students, cadets, young professionals, or indeed whether they are more senior professionals who really need to engage in this study. And we do that not simply by thinking about all of the ways in which we can study war, but rather how we can explain this phenomenon. There are some out there who would argue that war is in fact a science, that it's mechanistic, that there are predetermined outcomes in war, and that the study of war should primarily be about determining whether a state will win or lose a war in advance of engaging in it in an effort to prevent war or in an effort to predict war's outcome. But the military historian, philosopher, and practitioner, Karl von Clausewitz, would argue rather the contrary, that war is an art, not a science, that it must be understood as a human endeavor, and that understanding war is not about making predictions. It's rather about thinking through what war is, how it's fought, what is timeless in warfare, and what is bound by time. We recognize, of course, that warfare in the ancient world is different from warfare in the modern world. I have had the privilege to circulate with U.S. troops on the battlefield in Iraq. I've had the privilege of studying Caesar in the classroom, and there are worlds of helicopters and tanks and technology that obviously do not impinge in the same way on our study of ancient warfare. But what links ancient warfare to the study of modern warfare is the individual human beings who compose these systems, the states that are making decisions, the formulation of policy, and the human dimensions of war. Not just tragedy, but actually controlling events, making decisions, having choice. The thing that has struck me most in the process of teaching cadets and in the process of teaching civilians is how many of us, as Professor Black said, do not believe that individuals have a choice when it comes to war. That they feel that war is somehow a necessity and that it is an overwhelming trend in which human decision-making is simply a small part. And what I have learned in the study of war is that actually human decision-making is the largest component of the study of war, and understanding how human beings make decisions and why they make the decisions they do is the key and essential way to study war, not in all of its horror, but in all of its humanity. Why do human beings, why do states choose to go to war in the first place? Why, in fact, are command decisions taken on the battlefield? These are not questions that should be reserved for professionals in the study of war. This is not for officers. This is for all of us, and I'd like to explain why. Because war is an extension of policy, we really can't think about these military operations as a black box that we leave to professionals so that they can consider what to do on the ground, why they do things on the ground, and make in our policy decisions some sort of imaginary leap or imaginary divide between the kinds of decisions that are taken in Washington, D.C., or in Paris, or in London, St. Petersburg, or anywhere around the world, that is to say, in world capitals, and those decisions that are actually made on the battlefield, because those decisions are linked. What policymakers decide at home has an impact on what the mission is abroad, and it is the goal, job, and responsibility of a commander in war to translate this mission into a set of concrete objectives that his subordinates can execute. So if the mission is, for example, establish a free, stable, democratic Iraq at peace with its neighbors and an ally in the war on terror, as the White House is now stating is the mission of U.S. forces in Iraq, the question for commanders is, how should that be translated into a set of coherent military objectives? How can that task be divided up? What are the essential military tasks that need to be accomplished to achieve those objectives? And that is what commanders in the field do ask. They think of ways of accomplishing this task, whether it's removing Saddam Hussein from power, or whether it is keeping populations in Baghdad secure from insurgents. These are interim steps that are taken to achieve this overall political goal. And without this overall political goal, there's no purpose to the violence that we see on the ground. But each of these tasks, as a commander divides it out, is a decision that a commander makes about what is important and how to achieve the objective. And it comes from his interaction with his chain of command. And in the United States, as you know, the chain of command runs from the President as the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Armed Forces to the Secretary of Defense, and from there to various commanders in various echelons on the ground. That means that policymakers have a direct effect on the decision-making of commanders in the field. It also means that the mission sets that commanders in the field develop really must, in some way, accomplish overarching policy objectives. And it is the duty and responsibility of the President of the United States and his Secretary of Defense, and indeed of all of us, less specifically, as citizens of a democracy, to evaluate whether or not the missions, whether or not the course of a war is actually achieving its objectives. And I certainly know, whether teaching cadets or civilians, that that's a question on the forefront of anyone's mind who was born and lived through the events of 2001, 2002, 2003. And I've taught the 9/11 generation in my classroom, and they're interested to know why, whether, how a state should go to war, and how to evaluate a war's success or failure, because it's very much part of their political discourse and part of their life. That means that we, as military historians, can actually provide a great service to citizens of our democracy and policymakers who are engaged in decisions of the day. Whether a state should go to war, why wars are won and lost, how should one evaluate a war plan? Are the failures of an ongoing operation failures of planning or failures of execution? When do you change a strategy? When do you change a commander? How do you learn lessons from warfare, and how do you incorporate those into institutions? These are the questions that we as historians of military operations can ask, that can inform policy, and that can, in fact, have an important impact on the nature and quality of discourse in American public life. But then we ask, how is it as military historians that we can best evaluate those questions? How is it that we can learn the answers to those questions? Why are wars won and lost? Are the problems those of planning or execution? And as much as our students wish to know about current affairs and the modern world, they bring into the study of the modern world their various political prejudices, their various views of various players, and their various biases toward one position or another. And so the ancient world provides actually a very interesting laboratory for the study of these same questions in a value-neutral environment. Because we can understand through ancient sources why states go to war, planning failures, execution failures, learning lessons from war, and all of these other large, broad themes that are really part and parcel of why we study war. And we can learn these things from the ancient world, not because warfare is the same in all eras, but because human beings tend to make decisions in particular ways and respond to their circumstances in particular ways. And this is why I would encourage you to study decision-making in warfare and to study the human dimension of warfare and to think about the ancient world as a way of thinking about what makes war war, a human phenomenon involving states and institutions and individuals. Why? Why is it that a particular commander makes a particular decision at a particular moment? These are things that we need to understand and explain in military history, and we can do this best of all, I think, by reference to the ancient world. The ancient world is full of wonderful sources. Polybius, Herodotus, Thucydides, my personal favorite, Caesar's commentaries. And these sources are accessible to our students in English, but they are also particularly accessible to all of us who want to learn about the study of war, past and present, because ancient history and ancient historians are all about the study of their specific times and eras, but also the general phenomena of war, of society, of states, and decision-making. And so the sources themselves really encourage us to ask questions about the ancient world and about our own times. And they're provocative, and they are full of wonderful details and examples of the nature of command, of decision and choice of individuals and institutions. The sources are also, in fact, particularly wonderful for studying warfare because warfare in the ancient world, although it was a truly complex phenomenon, is in fact, in some ways, simpler than war is today. Not because war was simple then, or because technology simplifies war, or lack of technological progress makes war simpler, but in part because the state systems, institutions and structures, the command relationships, and indeed the technological relationships, make warfare in the ancient world comprehensible through the reading of a few sources rather than through the reading of the massive amounts of literature, archives, documents that we would find for any episode in the modern world. We can learn about command decisions in Caesar from reading Caesar's memoirs in a way that we cannot understand the command decisions of an Eisenhower or a Patton from reading their memoirs, because of the extraordinary echelons of organization that have developed over the course of time and have, in a certain sense, distanced commanders from the battlefield. Caesar commanded his battles. He also commanded his campaigns. He commanded his wars, and he also was, for some time, consul, proconsul, and dictator of the Roman state. That is to say, in the same person, we had a decision maker on policy, a decision maker on when and whether to go to war, a decision maker of where to fight wars and how to allocate resources, and then how to fight a battle, when to fight a battle, and where. Whereas in the modern world, as you well know, we have different echelons of people and different organizations making those decisions. And so in a certain sense, the ancient world offers in a compressed way the questions of grand strategy, operations, and tactics that are fundamental to the study of war. That is to say, we can see all of these echelons by reading a single book rather than by reading volumes and volumes of sources. I want to review these levels of war quickly because I think that we cannot really understand the course of military operations without understanding these fundamental concepts that military professionals have developed in order to analyze war and in order to analyze why wars are won and lost. And it's easiest if we start on the battlefield with tactics, which is the art of winning battles and the art of fighting in the close engagement. We shift up to operations. The operational level of war is how and when a commander and his armed forces set the terms of a battle, link specific battles together, both in space and in time, in order to achieve a higher objective. So when we talk about a campaign, such as the campaign of 1812, we're talking about linking battles together successively in order to achieve an overarching objective that Napoleon had, namely the defeat of Russia, in order to bring it back into the political order that Napoleon desired. Above operations, we have strategy, which involves the decisions about war and peace within a given theater and the allocation of resources within a given theater in order to achieve overarching objectives. What the strategic level of war is changes over time. We can debate now whether strategy in Iraq is whether Iraq is its own strategic theater, whether it is contained unto itself, or whether strategy for Iraq needs to be considered in the context of the Middle East. But when we think about strategy, we think about the ways in which all of the operations on the ground, whether it be Normandy to Battle of the Bulge, or the invasion of Russia all the way through Borodino and back again, are linked together to achieve the overarching political objective of any campaign. And then grand strategy is the use of all of the resources of a state to achieve particular objectives. How and when should one go to war against one power rather than another? Should one invest more in one's army or navy? Should one solve a problem through peace or through war? These are the levels of war, tactics, operations, strategy, and grand strategy, by which professional analysts think about war. And we can use them to study war in any time period, whether modern or ancient, or anywhere in between, because they describe, in a certain sense, what war is about. A hierarchy of objectives, a hierarchy of organizations, a hierarchy of people making decisions in order to accomplish an overarching purpose. And so when we think about studying military history, when we actually teach it in the classroom, I have always begun by teaching the levels of war, and I've always begun by teaching the levels of war in the ancient world, precisely because through the reading of Thucydides or Polybius or Caesar, one can introduce one's students to all of the range of the levels of war, from battles up to grand strategy. And one can do so in a way that is incredibly human and focused on the decision makers, the commanders, and those who have actually been responsible for the formulation and execution of policy. And as with Professor Black, I think it's very important that students know that as individuals, they can have an important role in shaping policy and in shaping decisions and in participating in events, rather than being beings in the stream of history just kind of floating along. The ancient sources, I think, are particularly wonderful, therefore, for studying decision and choice, which is rather old-fashioned in our age. Right? We study structures, we study processes, we study trends in American history. Whereas ancient historians studied individuals, decisions, events. They studied debate, they studied rhetoric, they studied policy as something that decision makers made rather than something that inevitably arose from a concatenation of uncontrollable circumstances. And so looking at an ancient source makes it easier to study some of these old-fashioned themes that are nevertheless poignant and relevant in the modern world. I think of all of the works of ancient history that I've read, the one that I have found most relevant to the study of modern war and to the study of command are the commentaries of Caesar, which normally we read as students of Latin in our first Latin prose class, because Caesar was a brilliant writer, because he was an extraordinary prose author. He was also a poet, although that doesn't survive. He was incredibly gifted in the clarity of his explanation. And of course, he was an incredibly important figure in Roman history. And so in a certain sense, those of us who've taken Latin and who've been introduced to the study of the ancient world have always begun with what is perhaps the best source on command ever written in all of history, Caesar's commentaries. But that's not, of course, how we normally study Caesar's commentaries. But I'd like to make an argument for beginning the study of warfare, and particularly of command in war, with the commentaries of Caesar, not only because they're well written and well translated, but also because Caesar offers us an insight into what commanders do on the battlefield that is as relevant today as it was in Caesar's own time, as relevant today as it was when Napoleon studied Caesar, as relevant today as when the ancients studied Caesar, because the phenomenon of command in war is the phenomenon of human beings making decisions in crisis and of exercising judgment at critical moments when a clear outcome, the true choice of right or wrong, is a matter of judgment, not a matter of fact. Caesar is unique in all of the history of command, I think, for writing not only about himself, commanders do that rather often, don't they, but for writing about himself with such confidence that we can see the mistakes that he made as well as the successes that he had. He was so egotistical and so solipsistic that he really didn't care if he reported his mistakes and failures, because he also could report his successes and his achievements. And so his sources, his tales of himself, are wonderfully full of all of the errors that he makes, as well as all of the great things that he's done. And therefore, they're a laboratory for us to understand what a great commander does in war, because I think no one would deny that Caesar was a great commander, but also how a great commander works, succeeds or fails, overcomes problems, and sometimes isn't really so great at all, because there are moments in Caesar's career when he loses battles. The Battle of Gergovia in the Gallic Wars comes to mind, when he loses control of situations around him, when he is in fact surrounded by all of the Gauls in a small position on a hill in France, and really has no right to win the campaign for Gaul. Caesar makes mistakes, and he tells us all about them. And so for those of us who want to understand what commanders do on the battlefield, we don't have to take Caesar's word for all of the things that he's done and done well. We can also learn from his errors and his mistakes, and we discover that Caesar is not in the right place at the right time, but more often than not, in the wrong place at the right time, and has to compensate for watching a battle develop, evaluating risks and opportunities, and making mistakes in his assessment of the situation that sometimes prevent him from succeeding. That is to say, we can learn through reading Caesar whether problems that occurred on the battlefield are problems of planning or execution, why, in fact, he won or lost his battles, why, in fact, he often lost his battles but won wars. And I think that these are valuable exercises for any student of history and any student of military history. We learn that Caesar was sometimes a terrible tactician, that he really didn't know how to fight battles better than other Roman generals. But we learn that he compensated for the fact that he would sometimes lose battles against good and bad adversaries by stringing battles together in a way that his adversaries could not. That is to say, by continuing to maneuver, to campaign, and to fight when other adversaries would give up. To use speed, surprise, and intelligence as a way of gaining an upper hand on the enemy. And also for never underestimating his enemy, but rather thinking about his enemy as a living, breathing force with whom he had to estimate at any moment in order to make a correct decision. So we see in Caesar a way to approach command, and a way to approach command decision-making and understanding war that allows us to understand not only Caesar and Caesar's time, but also the nature of command in general. And I don't think that I've ever found anything more helpful to my study of modern war and to my study of modern command than the study of Caesar. Because General Petraeus, General Odierno, U.S. commanders in Iraq, or General George Washington, General Grant, General Lee, have to make these same sorts of evaluations. They have to perform these same functions on the battlefield. And in fact, by studying the universal framework of command and command decision-making, the human dimension of war, we can actually then better appreciate how technology, states, and systems change war over time. Because we understand what the human parameters of decision-making in wartime are. And we understand why warfare was, in fact, more complex in the era of Grant and Lee, and more complex still in the era of Eisenhower and Patton, and more complex still in the era of Petraeus and Odierno than it was in the ancient world. It's not simply because of technology, as I told you before, it's also because of institutions. The complexity and scope and scale and size of war. The extraordinary things that one hopes to accomplish with war. And the extraordinary organizations with which one fights. And we learn about these changes in institutions, how important it is to have different branches of government with separation of powers, how important it is to have competition among services, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marines. How, in fact, supply in war differs in modern times from ancient times. How, in fact, projecting power throughout the world is a problem that global powers face, whether they are Rome or whether they are the United States. Both of which powers took 3 to 6 months to deploy their forces to the eastern frontier, the Tigris River Valley, the Euphrates River Valley, whether they used airplanes or whether they marched on foot. These are endemic problems of states. How to deploy forces, how to organize their militaries. What differs are the answers to those questions in any age. And so if we begin the study of warfare in the ancient period, we open up a framework to studying warfare in all future periods, thinking about political controversies in their context, thinking about human beings and the extraordinary burden of decision that is on any human being in combat, thinking about state institutions and how they help us or hurt us in fighting war, thinking about risk and contingency, ethics and judgment, all of which are endemic in the human nature of war. When Karl von Clausewitz advocated studying war as a professional and as a professor, he advocated doing so to understand the phenomenon. And he thought that there were really three intellectual activities involved in understanding war. The first, the interpretation of equivocal facts. Second, tracing effects back to causes. And third, the investigation and evaluation of means employed. By interpretation of equivocal facts, he meant historical research proper, he says. That is to say, determining what happened and where it happened, when it happened. And in a confusing, chaotic environment like battle, in a complex human system like an army, determining what happened, whether in peacetime or in wartime, is an awfully difficult thing to do. And this is something that our students need to know how to do in their study of history. Tracing effects back to causes. This is what Clausewitz calls critical analysis. It's his evaluation of why events happen after establishing what those critical facts were. You have to establish why events occurred. And this is a matter of interpretation and even of judgment. But we can do this in warfare just as we can do it in any study of any historical event. It is not so confusing and so chaotic and so complex that it's beyond study. Rather, it's confusing and complex and human and requires study and interpretation. Why did what happened on the battlefield happen? What went wrong and why? Why did a commander make a particular decision? Why did his organization not perform as expected? This is all about tracing effects back to causes. And as long as we have the documentation, which we do, in abundance, we can study this in war, even as civilians. Thirdly, the investigation and evaluation of means employed. By this, Clausewitz means criticism, and this brings me back to the theme of my topic, that war is an extension of policy, and that it can be studied, and should be studied, as an extension of policy. Not as a black box that can only be known to professionals, but as something the dynamics of which will then come up to the surface of policy decisions in Washington, in London, in Paris, and in capitals around the world. That what happens on the battlefield cannot actually be divorced from the discussions and political debates about whether or how a war should continue to be pursued and what comes next. Because the investigation and evaluation of means employed is really about judging our commanders in the field and what they do and their level of responsibility. And of course, we as human beings want to make those judgments. But in order to do so, and to do so responsibly in a way that informs policy, we must do so on the basis of understanding what commanders knew at any given moment, why they made the decisions they did, what other options were in front of them, why they chose the one that they chose, how their choice fit into the overall mission, why they succeeded, why they failed, to what extent the responsibility was theirs or that of a lower echelon of command, that of a higher echelon of command, that of their organizations, of their soldiers, or of their states. That is, after all, why we study war as citizens of a great democracy. We study war in order to be able to evaluate and make decisions about military policy that belong to all of us as voters, to exercise civilian control over the military, which is the responsibility of our Commander-in-Chief and the Secretary of Defense. And in order for them to be able to make decisions about policies pursued, they need to know why wars are being won and lost, and have the nuance, history, and perspective to make those critical judgments that affect us all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kagan. We're open for questions. If you have a question, it would be nice if you raised your 10 card. The first question goes to you, but I can't see your name from this distance.
I turned it sideways. You told me to. Lee Esterlid from the Illinois Mathematics and Science Academy, which is in Aurora. Maybe I misinterpreted what you were saying, but since you mentioned George Washington with Julius Caesar, I wanted to ask you some pointed questions.
Good.
First, you mentioned Caesar's commentaries to me always seemed far more operational than policy. Roman policy is never determined concerning Gaul. Matter of fact, Caesar operates endlessly super-legally. And therefore, he's an illegal person operating in a non-democratic fashion in a supposedly democratic state, and I don't understand the lessons for this. I also think Washington would have been not so happy to be compared to Caesar, maybe Cincinnatus. The other fact is that Caesar was handed an ideal tool for the process, which is the Roman army. And people like Grant, well, Grant to a point, but certainly not Washington, was not handed an ideal tool. I don't see that. Also, Caesar wins quite often through trickery, through mass slaughter, through stealing, through rape, pillage, looting, and burning. I also don't see how that's a good lesson for that. Also, when I teach political theory and I teach some military history classes, Caesar to me is operational, but I don't see how it's policy. I also don't see how it's a good lesson for democratic citizens to understand the nature of warfare, unless you mean for movement from a democracy under someone who's relatively psychopathic to an empire.
I am not suggesting by any means that we should study Caesar in order to emulate him. And I think that we have to recognize that although so much of the study of command in the 19th century was all about emulating past commanders, there's a reason to study command that is not because we want to be Caesar. I hope nobody does, nor because we think Caesar was a good human being, but because he was a commander and a very successful one at that. And we really should think about Caesar very much, whether we're evaluating George Washington or Grant or Lee or Lincoln, precisely because so much of what he did was controversial. And for those of us who teach students in the 9/11 generation who want to understand when and why to go to war, and what kinds of boundaries Republican and Democratic institutions pose upon their commanders and should impose upon their commanders, understanding the outbreak of the Roman civil wars is actually a very good value-neutral place to begin, because my students, at least, do not come in with a preconceived notion that Caesar was wrong to go to war against Pompey, nor that the Senate was wrong to go to war against Caesar, but in fact can look at those policy decisions and think, what was the right thing to do? Perhaps both were wrong. Secondly, the political situation in the late Roman Republic gives the students an opportunity to think about what the subject of military debate should be, and how much it should be about individuals and personalities, and how much it should be about policies. And I think that there's a huge scope, particularly at the beginning of the Civil Wars, but also at the beginning of the Gallic Wars, to talk about this very issue. Yes, Caesar is, in fact, an operational commander and a tactical commander, and we can study these things as well as his political vision and the way in which he tries to realize his political vision through war. And I would say, exactly, that's what makes him so good to study as a source. Precisely because we can see very directly the connection between what he does on the battlefield and what he does in Rome, and what his overarching goals and objectives are for any particular war and campaign, and how he fights. Because these two things cannot be separated. They cannot be separated. They are a continuum. And we see that best in Caesar because he's one individual who is thinking about all of the different echelons of war and also thinking about policy. Finally, I think that Caesar gives us a very interesting lesson in what relationship a commander has to his army and whether the army makes a commander successful. And I think those of us who study military history would understand very well that a good army makes a commander or enables a commander to be more successful, but it doesn't make a commander successful. The commander actually has an important role to play in war. He makes decisions, and a bad decision at the top command echelons can mean that you can have the best army in the world, say the American army, and it can still not be succeeding in achieving its mission. Caesar gives us a very interesting look at the ideal army, that is, say, the Roman army of his time, which was undoubtedly well-equipped, well-organized, and well-trained. But Caesar also fought another Roman army, equally equipped, equally armed, and equally trained. And so we can ask what happens, or we can sort of use that as a constant for evaluating what his command decision-making actually achieved. And we can also see Caesar, through the African wars, have an army that's disentangled and not functional, and see what a commander does in such a circumstance, and how Caesar, rather remarkably, can overcome an army that is neither well-trained, nor well-equipped, nor well-positioned, nor well-supplied. And so for all of those reasons, I think that he is a wonderful case study for ancient and modern times, even without being a person whom any democratic citizen would wish to emulate.
Okay, we have a question from Sam Varsano at Parsippany Hills High School in New Jersey.
Who in New Jersey? Great.
I'm sorry?
Great for New Jersey.
Yes, it is. I apologize if this is going to be a very simplistic or perhaps even an obvious question, but it's not obvious to me. And it comes out of an assignment that I give every year where my students chronicle the history of American conflict and count up how many times there was a declaration of war from Congress associated with it. So here's the question. Since you say that war is a product of policy, why is it that we, and this hasn't been a robust search, but I think we've identified, a maximum of 5 declarations of war that Congress passed. Why is it that we are so disinclined to involve Congress in its constitutional mandate and still get engaged in very serious conflicts and wars even to this day?
I think that's a fascinating question, and I think it's one really worth studying because of its implications for American history, but also because of the timeless questions behind it that really get to the nature of war and to the nature of states. I can't give you an answer. I can't give you this is why we've had Congress declare war X times, but we've gone to war Y times. But what I can say is that when we're discussing why and when and how war should and can be an extension of policy, we have to think about what the different branches of government bring to the the conduct of a war. What is the proper role of the commander-in-chief? What is the proper role of Congress? How should they interpret their roles? And how is it that the very nature of warfare, in a certain sense, makes it natural for the executive to be the commander-in-chief, and makes it undesirable for Congress to be commander-in-chief. That is to say, the commander-in-chief sets the missions for the armed forces, whereas Congress traditionally has the responsibility for determining whether or not a state should go to war or make peace, and also for providing funds for the war. But Congress doesn't necessarily have as its role dictating missions for the armed forces on the ground in a conflict. And one of the reasons for that is that there's a reason why there is a chain of command that runs from one individual to a next individual to a next individual, rather than from one group to another group to another group. The setting of missions requires an evaluation of goals and objectives, ends and means, an evaluation of what one wishes to accomplish, but also a coherence of policy in all of those realms. In order to set a mission properly, you have to think about all of those questions. And the mission needs to be set essentially by one person in consultation with others. Because the idea of having some sort of compromised legislative mission really, in a certain sense, gets in the way of how a military hierarchy can and needs to function. Now, we can debate that. We can debate where the relationship of Congress should end and where the president's responsibilities should begin. But there's a reason in warfare why the Senate of Rome and the people of Rome made decisions on whether or not wars should be fought and where. But the commander in the field had the power to set missions and make decisions about how to fight and how to allocate resources. So I think that this is one of the universal questions of warfare in a democratic society, and one that's very much worthy of attention, both in the context of American history and also in the context of world history.
Okay, we'll turn to Professor Angelo Codavilla.
This is not a question, but a comment occasioned by the first question, and indeed the second, which I think dovetail.
Speaking to the microphone.
I believe the first and second questions dovetail, and I'd like to comment on them very briefly. You are absolutely correct that Caesar acted in an illegal way, and that no man was more a negative example during the American founding than Caesar. On Caesar's behalf, it should be said that the Roman constitutional order against which he worked was in full breakdown, and his problem was how to deal with that. His intention was not to become Augustus. His intention was not to become what Augustus became, but rather to actually try to restore some kind of semblance of what the old Roman constitutional order should be. In that process, he did a whole bunch of things, but one should not impute to him the desire to become what he eventually did become. And again, one must remember that he was not working in the context of a fully functioning, uncorrupted Senate. The Senate had been corrupted a long time before. Factional fighting had become the rule in Rome for the previous 75 years, and it was murderous. And the question was, how do you operate in that context? The second question on the U.S. declarations of war, refers, it seems to me, to the same question of whether the body politic is itself coherent and competent. The writers of the Constitution of the United States assumed that Congress would set, like the Roman Senate, not only who we were going to fight, where we were going to fight, but that there would be a debate about ends. Now, it is certainly it is perfectly obvious that a body of men cannot set operations, but a body of men, a body of representatives of the people, can darn well set the objectives and give some very concrete guidance as to the coherence. That was the conception. Anyone reading the Federalist Papers will see that was the conception behind giving the Congress the exclusive. By the way, it's the only exclusive right that exists in the Constitution of the United States. All other rights are somehow shared. The right to declare war is strictly that of Congress. It was an assumption made in view, perhaps the wish was stronger than the evaluation, that the American body politic would be coherent. That turned out to be not quite so in the War of 1812 already, and certainly subsequent events proved that the American body politic is not quite as coherent as had been hoped. Where that leaves us today is by default with presidential powers. This is not something that one ought to be happy with. And does this, in fact, present a danger of Caesarism? I submit to you that it does, and that it is not a matter of Caesarism by assertion, but by default.
I should add that Professor Cordovilla served on the Senate staff of the Senate Intelligence Committee and also served as a Foreign Service officer, so in some sense represents both branches of two of the branches of government. We have a question from Mackie Luffman, University School of Nashville in Tennessee. Is there a specific English translation of Caesar you would recommend for high school students?
There are so many wonderful translations of Caesar that I think that you should purchase whichever book you like, that you like to read, and that you find has the right kinds of maps and graphics for your students.
Do we have any other questions from the floor here? Yes, Richard Bruno.
Dr. Kagan, I have a two-part question that will draw on both your teaching and scholarly experience. I think one of the important benefits of studying war is to try to get students to think strategically, both in terms of history and also in terms of their own lives. I was wondering if you would comment on your experience in trying to convey the concepts of strategy, taught in a wide number of locales. And then secondly, ever since Edward Luttwak published the Strategy of the Roman Empire in the late 70s, the question has been, I guess, out there, to what extent did the Romans think strategically? And I know you've done some research in that area, and maybe compare ancient concepts of strategy to the modern world.
Thank you. I love these questions. Let me take the first. How can one teach students to think strategically? And if you will believe me, it's actually harder to teach cadets how to think strategically than it is to teach civilians. And this is not because of any fundamental nature of cadets. They are 18 and 19 years old when they came into my classroom, and they are like all other 18 and 19-year-olds, new, young, eager, curious, and also tired. But they are in the process of studying military art and military history, in part to develop a sense of the military profession, what it means to serve as an officer in combat and in peacetime in the American Army. And so many cadets approach the study of military history with a narrow view that 5 years from now, I am going to be a second lieutenant. And they think very much about what they need to do to be a good second lieutenant, precisely because this is the first job that they're going to have after college. And like all 18 and 19-year-olds, they're worried about how they're going to perform in their first job after college. The problem is that lieutenants don't think strategically. The job of a lieutenant is to run a small unit in the United States Army, and although lieutenants have much decision-making to do, they do not have the kinds of responsibilities that senior commanders do. And so I like to use military history and the focus on senior commanders as a way of getting students to think about problems that otherwise they would not have to wrestle with for 20 or 30 years. And I tell them that this is their last chance to be generals until they actually get their stars. Then they kind of sigh and they don't really believe that they'll get their stars, or they're quite confident that they will and they'll wait for them. But it is really important, I think, to make it clear that one needs to think about the strategic level of war before one gets to the point where one is actually making strategic decisions. Otherwise, one very often does not have the intellectual capacity to make decisions about strategy. Now, that said, I think one of the most effective ways of teaching about strategy and strategic decision-making is not by presupposing that any particular war is right or wrong in its conduct, or that policymakers went to war for any one particular reason, or that it was a good idea or bad idea to fight any particular war. I mean, we often go into the study of war with these biases, but they're not productive for us as historians. Rather, we should be asking, why did a state go to war at a particular moment? Why did its military leadership and political leadership think that was a good thing to do? Or why did they think it was a bad thing to do, but necessary, given the confluence of events and the situation in the world in which their state found themselves? And to what extent were they reacting to circumstance or shaping circumstance? And to what extent were they, in fact, able to shape circumstances? And why could they not do it as well as they thought? Because I really don't think that there are very many strategic thinkers out there, whether Pericles or Hannibal or indeed Caesar, or moving into the modern world, are various wartime commanders and peacetime commanders who've actually made all of the right decisions all of the right time. That's why, in fact, we have to exercise our faculties of judgment about them, and we have to realize that they were making evaluations of a situation at a given place, at a given time, and we must not presume the outcome, but rather consider the range of options that were there in front of them. And to do this, I think the best success I've had is putting my students in the position of decision makers, not necessarily in a role-playing environment, but actually debating these policies that are old and tired and have nothing to do with their modern lives, except that they are decisions of war and peace and decisions of statecraft and decisions of strategy. And here, of course, the Peloponnesian War is classically the study that we use. And since I know that we'll have a speaker on Thucydides, I will not discuss that. But I think that there are also some particularly interesting Roman examples. Polybius offers a wonderful opportunity to think about how small states think strategically, how large powers think strategically, why wars have the outcome that they do, and why policymakers fail to achieve their objectives. So to think about strategy, we think about decision-making, and we think about options, and we think about them in a very particular context from the framework of the decision makers. And we can apply this to any level of war. We can think about tactics this way, and we can think about grand strategy this way, and we can think about operations this way. And I think it's important to do so in the study of military history because command is about judgment. And it's about making decisions. And the one thing that I heard first and foremost from my students in the field when they first got to Iraq in 2003 is that Their education at West Point taught them that there would be choices before them, but that they should always make the right choice. They should always do the right thing. Do the right thing, take care of soldiers, and as one of my infantrymen likes to say, flank left, by which he means don't attack, don't make a frontal attack. Those are the things that he learned in his infantry basic course. Well, what is the right thing to do? That's a matter of judgment on the basis of the circumstances as you see them. And it's one of the qualities of human beings that we don't all make decisions perfectly and in the right way. And so I think teaching about strategy is not only teaching about successes, but teaching about the failures of human beings to achieve their ends and understanding why there's such a difficulty for states in wartime and peacetime to achieve their objectives. Now, if I have a moment to take the second question, did the Romans think strategically? I actually want to answer this not because it's inherent to our study of Roman history, but rather because I think it's a very fundamental question for understanding not only the Romans in their time, but American foreign policy today and American military policy today. There is a tension in any state between following a desired course and trying to make decisions about the future, and then wrestling with the circumstances in which a state finds itself. And that's an interaction. You can't simply create the world in the way that you want it to be, and you don't start from zero every time you consider a problem in defense or foreign policy or military policy. Rather, you start from a set of circumstances, institutions, and organizations that you have. You ask questions about where you want to get to. And then sometimes circumstances help dictate where you go. Sometimes you make choices in order to head your state in a certain direction. And at times, you're reacting as well as setting the terms. That's the nature of war. That's one of those universal dimensions of war that we wrestle with as military historians that we can see in the ancient and modern world. And in fact, if we study Roman history and think about grand strategy in the Roman era, we see a large power, a global power, amidst all sorts of states and non-state actors wrestling with how to defend itself, but also how to keep order in the world, how to project forces overseas, and how to use force rather than diplomatic means, or diplomatic means rather than force, to solve particular contingencies that arose. Well, I think that there's no more wonderful example than for studying this and for studying wars of choice and their dynamics, studying the projection of power and its dynamics, then perhaps Rome in the Greek East in the 2nd century BC, so the study of Livy and Polybius and the Roman decision to go to war in Greece to defend Italy, or the study of the later Roman Empire, my own passion, through sources such as Ammianus Marcellinus, who was an adjutant to a late Roman general. The reason why these cases are so interesting is that there are problems that global powers have formulating strategy and making choices that are characteristic of global powers at any time, at any age. Should we go to war, the Romans would ask, in Greece or Spain? Because we have responsibilities in both. Is protecting Italy more important than setting the terms of the international order, homeland defense versus engagement overseas? How can one use one's vast army to handle multiple contingencies that emerge at the same time, when in fact it's not large enough to handle multiple contingencies at the same time? How and when should you pool your forces into one great big strategic reserve that you move all around the empire? And how and when should you parcel them out and put them on different frontiers and let them stay for a long time? I think those are questions that we can all recognize from the current policy events and the current problems of American strategy. But we can study them all out of the context of Iraq and out of the context of Vietnam and even out of the context of the U.S. Civil War. By looking at the Romans, not as an empire, not as an evil power or a good power, something to emulate or something to stray away from, but rather as a global power with the problems of a global power, struggling with war and peace in its age. And I really think that it's a wonderful example of how we can use these ancient exemplars not for moral reasons, but for educational reasons, so that we can learn about the nature of war at all time periods, and then so that we can use that understanding to help us comprehend the modern world in which we live, not more objectively, using scholarly judgment, using a degree of dispassion, thought, and rationality that we learn from our study of history. So thank you very much.
Thanks to Dr. Kagan for actually giving two speeches, first elaborating on some of the points made by Jeremy Black on why to teach military history, and then taking the first stab at the ancient world. We'll return at 2:30 for a return to the ancient world with Professor Carl Walling. 2:30. Thank you.